This is one of the most frequently asked questions I keep seeing. Can you use a two-handed sword with one hand? Yes. Does it make sense? No. Okay, thanks, bye. Why are you still there? Oh, so you want the long answer. More information. Okay, fine. To make things a bit more interesting, before I go on to explain the reasons for my answer, let's talk briefly about exceptions. Because as with almost any statement you can make, there are exceptions. Like this, for instance, is a very light, narrow blade. It has a two-handed grip, but it can also be wielded with one hand without difficulty. By the way, I'm not holding it the wrong way around. The edge is indeed on the inside. So this kind of sword I can use with two hands, obviously, but I can also quite easily use with one hand because of how light it is and because of the balance. So this is really either way. And there's also the bastard sword or hand and a half sword, which I've made an entire video about. Link will be down below in the description. So there are exceptions. However, overall, if you are dealing with a sword that is designed for two-handed use, is it a good idea to use it with one? No. You would need a very good reason to do so. And that reason probably involves having your other arm cut off or otherwise incapacitated in historical or fantasy combat. So the reason is these are just not optimized for one-handed use. The blades are a lot longer, they're generally heavier, the balance is somewhat different. So yes, I can throw an effective cut with this, with one hand. It's a bit harder on the wrist, but it can be done, especially if you're stronger, etc. However, you're losing all or almost all the advantages of this. Power, obviously, with one hand compared to two. Also, for one reason that I don't think too many people are aware of. It's not just that two hands are better than one. It's also how you swing it with two hands. Because if you're doing it right, in order to maximize the power, you're not actually powering the cut with the main hand, but with the offhand. So you're actually pulling with this hand. The other one just doesn't even have to do anything. So what this does is it gives you a longer lever, because if you have it here, the distance from here, from the fulcrum to the point of impact is a lot shorter than if you hold it here. Now you can try that for yourself. Just pick up a stick or a baseball bat or whatever, grip it higher up, swing it around, grip it lower, swing it around. Which has more power? There's also a substantial difference in control. You have 2 points of contact as opposed to one. So in other words, the blade is not going to move or wiggle around as much if you hold it with both hands as opposed to just one. So this is why cuts are usually cleaner with two hands, because, well, you have more control over the edge alignment. Now, if you get good with a one-handed sword, you can cut just fine. You can get very good at that. Definitely. This is not to say that one-handed swords cannot cut well. That would be completely ludicrous to suggest. But there is a mechanical advantage here. You can also see when I throw a cut from the left to the right side in particular, my hands are crossed. So this locks my arms into this kind of position. Makes it less likely to twist around. So if I now throw a cut like this, it's much more stable than if I try to do it like this, because now I have to make sure that I keep everything stable with just this one hand and the wrist. And obviously swinging a larger, heavier weapon with one hand is more tiring. I don't have to explain that. Aside from these drawbacks, there are hardly any advantages to using a two-handed sword with one hand. Now, if you have an actual one-handed sword that is designed as such, that's a different story. Now you can use a shield or a buckler, and generally you wouldn't carry especially a shield with a two-handed weapon. You decide first, do I want a two-handed sword, do I want a one-handed sword? And then you stick to it. However, you can, of course, use some one-handed swords with two hands if the situation requires. If you don't have anything in your left and the handle is long enough, yes, you can definitely grab this with two hands, and now you have a little more control, a little more power. Not as much, because the distance just isn't that great. There's quite a difference between holding a sword here and holding it there. It makes more sense to use a one-handed sword with two hands than a two-handed sword with one hand. And you see that sometimes in historical depictions when a knight grabs a one-handed sword to deliver that extra powerful cut. So what could you potentially gain from switching to a one-handed grip? Well, obviously it frees up the other hand. So that could be used in grappling, for example, if you get into very close distance. So that could be done temporarily. Just let go of the sword and do whatever you need to with that hand, and then you go back to a two-handed grip. Perfectly possible. Sticking to it throughout the entire fight seems rather pointless. Yes, you could use a shield or a buckler, but again, you have no business combining that with a two-handed sword. Why have you picked this up in the first place? It is not ideal. It is way more cumbersome. It's going to be slower than an actual one-handed sword swung with one hand. One advantage it does give you is reach, because with one hand you actually can use more reach than with two. So I'm just going to go over here and show you. This is the maximum reach I have with a thrust, now without leaning forward, with two hands. Now with one hand, I can extend that to here. And even more so, I can turn my body more into it and go into more of a lunge, which has dramatically more reach than I can use with two hands. And a final issue to consider, generally swords that are intended to be used with two hands have longer blades. Now there are, again, exceptions. There are two-handed swords with fairly short blades, but usually they tend to be longer. So you have a longer lever. Unfortunately, your opponent can use that against you as well, because if they push against what is called the weak of the blade, as opposed to the strong, this is where they apply more force because of a longer lever. So if they push it aside with one hand, there's very little you can do against that. With the other hand, you have 2 points of contact, so it is harder to move your blade aside. It's still a mechanical advantage if your opponent binds here and pushes against your weak as opposed to further down, but this is amplified if you only have 1 point of contact. So this can very easily be knocked aside, and then you're just left there having to recover. So as you can see, you're giving up several advantages that a two-handed grip offers you for very little gain in return. So that's why I personally say it doesn't make any sense. What do you think? Let us know. And thanks for watching.